Nne, am I really cursed? She asked, feeling guilty and responsible for the loss of her loved ones. Why is my life like this? Why do I seem to lose everyone I love so much? She asked as she stared blankly into space. A long time ago, in the small village of Umumbedi, there lived a girl named Mbechi. She was loved and admired by the people of Umumbedi because of her kind and gentle spirit. Mbechi had a younger sister, Ugomma, and they lived with their widowed mother, Mrs. Uche. Mbechi and Ugomma were very close to each other that you couldn't find one of them without the other. Mbechi loved and treasured her little sister so much, and she ensured she attended to all of her needs without hesitation. And so did Mbechi's mother, because shortly after Ugomma was born, her husband suddenly slumped one day and passed away. So Mrs. Uche saw Ugomma as a consolation for the loss of her husband. She showered her with so much love and always wanted Ugomma at her side. Together, Mbechi, her sister, and their mother lived in love and peace. But little did they know that fate had plans that would change their lives forever. One fateful evening, while Mbechi and Ugomma were out gathering firewood that would be used to prepare dinner for the family, Ugomma suddenly felt very dizzy, and before she could tell Mbechi how she was feeling, she slumped on the bundle of firewood she had gathered. Mbechi rushed to her side and began calling for help. She called out for help again and again, but there was no one in sight to come to their aid. She struggled and managed to carry Ugomma, and she began to run home. As she ran home, some of the villagers who saw her carrying an unconscious Ugomma and running followed her to find out what the problem was. By the time Mbechi got home, her mother had already rushed outside the house in panic because she could see Mbechi running and screaming from a distance. Immediately Mbechi laid Ugomma on the floor. Mrs. Uche threw herself beside Ugomma's unconscious body and began to scream, shaking her body roughly. Mbechi quickly dashed off to call De Ogun, the village herbalist. She returned some minutes later with De Ogun, and by this time her compound was filled with concerned villagers. The local herbalist knelt beside Ugomma. He lifted her eyelids to observe her eyes, and then he went ahead to squeeze some local herbs into her mouth and continued to observe her. Few minutes later, he placed his ear on her chest to check for her heartbeat. He did this repeatedly 3 times, and after the 3rd time of checking for Ugomma's heartbeat, he slowly shook his head. When everyone present saw the gesture from De Ogun, they realized that what they all feared had happened. Ugomma had passed away. Mrs. Uche screamed and carried Ugomma's lifeless body, refusing to let go. Mbechi, who was still in great shock, stood motionless as tears dripped down her face. She stared at the body of her precious little sister, who was full of life just some minutes ago. She was confused about what must have happened to Ugomma. For the rest of that evening and several weeks following, Mbechi and her mother were in deep grief. Mrs. Uche would cry from morning till night, refusing to be consoled. She felt like she had lost her husband a second time. Mbechi, the once blossoming young girl, became a shadow of herself. As if the situation wasn't already terrible for Mbechi, Mrs. Uche, in her usual outbursts, blamed Mbechi for the demise of Ugomma. This accusation was too heavy for Mbechi to bear. She tried to convince her mother that she had no hand in what happened to Ugomma, but her explanations fell on deaf ears. Mrs. Uche continued to grieve, and as a result of that, she fell sick. Her health condition grew worse until one cold rainy morning when she passed on in her sleep. Mbechi, who wasn't yet aware of her mother's death, entered the room to administer her medications to her. "Nne," she called, "Deogo has just brought your morning medicine. Please sit up and take it," she added. But her mother did not respond. She tapped and shook her, yet there was no response. Then she ran out to call Deogo, who hadn't gone too far from the house. They both rushed into Mrs. Uche's room, and Deogo started to examine her. Mbechi trembled with fear. She was afraid that lightning was about to strike the same place twice. When she saw Deogo shake his head sorrowfully, she let out a loud scream and began to weep on her mother's lifeless body. Even though her mother had made her miserable with the constant grieving and false accusations about Ugoma's demise, Mbechi still loved her mother. She was the only surviving close family member Mbechi had. Left alone, dejected and in great sorrow, Mbechi had no one to run to. Her uncles and aunties accused her of being the cause of her predicament and concluded that she was cursed. None of them wanted her to live with them. They forcefully took away every possession her late parents had, including the piece of land on which she previously farmed for food items, both to feed and to sell to make some money. The only reason they didn't take the house where she lived was because they feared that the curse upon her also lived in the house. Even the villagers who once loved her turned their backs on her. Sometimes, while walking past a group of people, she would overhear them say things like, "This girl must be cursed. I heard that she lured her innocent little sister into the forest and squeezed life out of her. I also heard that her poor mother found out about this evil she had done and wanted to expose her, so she intentionally poisoned her food to also get rid of her." Comments like this made Mbechi want to end her life, but she knew that that was not the best option, and so she tried her best to ignore all the hurtful words from people. Mbechi's suffering multiplied. She could not fend for herself as every means of survival had been taken away from her. One morning, Mbechi thought to herself and said, "I have exhausted everything in this house. I don't even know where my next meal will come from. My family and friends have all forsaken me. If I remain here, I will not survive this hardship and loneliness." She remembered that her late father had taught her how to pray before his passing. So she knelt down and poured out her heart to God. "Oh Lord," she prayed, "why is my life like this? I have lost everything." The once beautiful and kind-hearted Mbechi, whom everyone loved, is now called the cursed girl. "You see and you know everything, and you know that I am innocent of these accusations. Circumstances have made me lose my place amongst my own people. Please come to my rescue, helper of the helpless." After crying out to God, Mbechi stood up and dried her eyes. She stepped outside the house and walked sorrowfully to the gravesites of her late mother and late sister. She wept all over again. When she could no longer find tears to express her sorrow, she went back into the house. She picked a few of her belongings and stepped outside the house again. This time, she turned around and looked for the last time at her house that once held loving memories. Then she walked away until she left the village of Omongbede. She had no particular destination in mind. All she wanted was to leave the village to a place where nobody knew who she was. When Mbechi was sure she had gone very far from Omongbede, it was already very late at night, and having only the moon to give her light, she found herself in a place that seemed to be a market square. She could see people locking up their stores and heading home, but she was too scared to ask for help. She watched until the last person packed up his goods and left the market. Feeling very hungry, tired and worn out from the journey, she made her way to the entrance of one of the locked stores. She laid some of her clothes on the hard, cold ground and passed the night there. Early the next morning, Mbechi felt someone tapping her repeatedly. She opened her eyes to find out it was already morning. Her stomach contracted with intense hunger, and she felt so weak that she could hardly move her body. She looked up to see a well-dressed woman whom she guessed would be in her late 50s, staring down at her. The woman looked very elegant and wore a beautiful dress that looked like a work of art. For a moment, Mbechi forgot about her rumbling stomach and the pounding headache she was feeling as she admired the woman's dress, wondering if she would ever be clothed in something as majestic as it. "Who are you?" the woman staring down at her asked. "Why are you sleeping at the entrance of my store? Are you okay?" the woman asked with fear and concern in her voice. "I am very sorry, madam." Mbechi apologized to the woman and hurriedly began to pick up the clothes she had spread on the ground the previous night. The woman felt pity for Mbechi, seeing how frail and scared she looked. Without another word, she unlocked her store and urged Mbechi to come in. Mbechi hesitated before going in because she didn't understand why this woman was being nice to a total stranger like her. The woman offered her a seat and asked her not to be scared. "What is your name?" the woman asked. "My name is Mbechi," Mbechi replied weakly. "I am Ujunwa, but everyone around calls me Auntie Uju," the woman responded with a smile. "I own this small fashion store. Don't you have a home?" Auntie Uju asked her. Mbechi shook her head, embarrassed by her circumstances. She went ahead to narrate her story to Auntie Uju. While narrating her story, Auntie Uju saw how hungry she looked, and she felt so much compassion for her. She excused herself and went to a nearby food stand to buy a plate of steaming porridge yam for her. She brought the food to her and urged her to eat first before continuing her story, but she did as she was told. After narrating her story, Auntie Uju empathized with her and asked her if she would like to work for her in her fashion store. She offered to teach her how to sew beautiful dresses like the one she was wearing and also give her a place to stay until she found her feet. Mbechi's heart leaped in her chest. It sounded too good to be true, but the sincerity in Auntie Uju's voice cleared her doubts. With tears welling up in her eyes, she went on her knees and started appreciating Auntie Uju. Auntie Uju held her hands and lifted her to her feet and said, "Don't cry, my dear. I am sure your stay here in Umweke town will be successful." She assured her that all would be well. And just like that, Mbechi's life began to change. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. Although the job was very tasking for Mbechi, as Auntie Uju's store was one of the very few fashion stores where people could make or mend their dresses in Umweke town, Mbechi dedicated herself to learning the craft from Auntie Uju. She learned to cut fabric, thread needles, and stitch dresses, and soon enough her skill blossomed. Auntie Uju noticed Mbechi's natural talent for combining colors and patterns. She encouraged her to start designing her own pieces, and before long, Mbechi's unique designs began attracting attention. Auntie Uju became not only a mentor to Mbechi but also a mother figure to her. She would usually call her Nne. She taught her the ins and outs of the fashion business. One day, after a very busy week, Auntie Uju called Mbechi, "My dear Chi," as she fondly called her. "You've grown so much and have been not just a loyal apprentice to me, but also the daughter I never had. I think it's time for you to take the next step." Mbechi did not really understand what Auntie Uju meant by the next step, but she was happy that Auntie Uju was pleased with her. 3 months later, Auntie Uju helped Mbechi take this next step as she prayed for her and gifted her some money to start up her own fashion business. That day was very memorable for Mbechi. She could not stop appreciating Auntie Uju, and her eyes dripped with tears of joy for the rest of the day. Even though she had left Auntie Uju's business, Mbechi spent every spare time she had with Auntie Uju. The bond between them remained intact. Mbechi opened her own fashion store in another part of Umweke. Her designs were very unique, and she began to get customers even from neighboring villages. Her success made her financially stable, but it also attracted something she never expected: love. On a few occasions, she exchanged glances with the furniture maker who had a small store few meters from hers. His name was Ifeanyi. Ifeanyi, just like Mbechi, had worked for his uncle, who was a well-known furniture maker in Umeke. He started his own furniture-making business a year before Mbechi moved into the area. Ever since he set his eyes on Mbechi, he felt very attracted to her. Ifeanyi was a shy and reserved young man, and so he tried to suppress his feelings for Mbechi. But all his efforts were in vain, because his heart would leap in his chest each time he saw her pass by. One evening, before the close of their daily business activities, he summoned courage and paid Mbechi a visit at her store. He pretended to be in need of her sewing services and engaged her in a little conversation. "Hello, madam," Ifeanyi said. "Good evening, sir. How may I help you?" Mbechi replied. Ifeanyi stammered, still trying to cook up the perfect excuse for being in her store. "I have a shirt that needs mending," he said. "Alright, can I see the shirt so I would know exactly what I need to fix?" Mbechi answered. Ifeanyi stammered again. "I didn't come with it to work today. Can I come back tomorrow with it?" He finally asked. "Of course, you can bring it to my store anytime you have it with you," Mbechi said to him. "Okay, thank you." He appreciated Mbechi as he hurriedly left her store before he embarrassed himself any further. Is this how this love thing is? It's not easy to woo a woman, Ifeanyi thought to himself as he walked back to his own store. Because Ifeanyi didn't want to appear as a liar to Mbechi, the next day, he returned to her store with a torn old shirt he had actually stopped wearing some months ago. From that day, they became friends. They shared similar values and their connection grew. A year later, Ifeanyi proposed marriage to Mbechi, and she happily accepted to marry him. Then came the time Mbechi had dreaded so much. It was time to take Ifeanyi to her family in Umumbidi. The thought of returning to her village plagued her and opened up the wounds inflicted on her by her people. However, Auntie Uju, whom Mbechi saw as the only family she had, encouraged her to return to her village and carry out the proper rites for her marriage. She also offered to join Mbechi to her village. With mixed feelings of anger and sadness, Mbechi returned to Umumbedi with Auntie Uju. When they arrived Umumbedi, her uncles, aunties, and the villagers who called her a cursed girl were in shock to see her alive and looking so beautiful. This was because when they no longer saw her in the village, they all concluded that she must have been eaten by some wild animals in the forest for killing her mother and her sister. But now that they saw that their allegations against her were false, they began to plead for her forgiveness. She cried bitterly as she recalled how they treated her with so much unkindness when she was at her lowest point in life. Auntie Uju, who was already crying along with her, at this point wrapped her arms around her and consoled her. She urged Mbechi to forgive them, and that God had now vindicated her and restored her honor and dignity. Auntie Uju's words felt like medicine to her wounded soul, and after a while of struggling with the pain in her heart, Mbechi forgave them. She felt as if a very heavy load had been lifted off her shoulders. After Mbechi reconciled with her extended family members, they returned all that they had forcefully taken away from her several years ago. She was happy that her inheritance had now been restored to her. She told them the purpose of her visit, and they excitedly asked her to come along with Ifeanyi on her next visit so that the marriage rites would begin as soon as possible. Mbechi took Ifeanyi and his people to her village to see her uncles as their custom demanded. Her uncles were amazed to see the successful and good-looking young man who had come to seek for Mbechi's hand in marriage. Few weeks later, all marriage rites were completed. Mbechi and Ifeanyi became husband and wife. The marriage ceremony was the talk of the village. There was so much for everyone to eat and drink. The couple looked so elegant and charming in their traditional attires made by Mbechi. Several years later, Mbechi and Ifeanyi had 3 beautiful children, 2 boys and a girl, Nnamdi, Obiora, and Chizaram. Life for them was so peaceful and progressive until Ifeanyi was plagued with a strange sickness. Nkechi cared for him day and night, but despite her efforts, one evening, she watched Ifeanyi gently close his eyes as his hand lost its firm grip on hers. At first, she thought he had fallen asleep, but when she couldn't hear the sound of his heavy breathing, she hurriedly put her head on his chest to check for his heartbeat. Still unsure of what was happening to Ifeanyi, she rushed to call the local herbalist. But by the time she returned to the house with the herbalist, Ifeanyi had transitioned to the other world. When the herbalist confirmed her fears, she screamed and wept bitterly. Her beloved husband had slipped away from her. Nkechi felt devastated. Once again, she found herself in grief, now with 3 children to care for. Auntie Uju mourned with her and tried all she could to comfort her, but no words could ease her sorrow. Nkechi began to wonder if she was truly cursed. One evening, Auntie Uju paid her and her children a visit. Sitting dejectedly and recalling the bitter events of her life, Nkechi, with a heavy heart, called out to Auntie Uju. "Nne, am I really cursed?" she asked, feeling guilty and responsible for the loss of her loved ones. "Why is my life like this? Why do I seem to lose everyone I love so much?" she asked as she stared blankly into space. "No, don't say that, my dear Chi. You are not cursed. You are a survivor of unimaginable loss, and none of this is your fault. It is not your fault that life happened this way. Don't let the weight of others' blame dim your inner light. You deserve love, compassion, and a chance to heal. Remember, you still have me and your 3 beautiful children, and we love you so much," Auntie Uju replied. Then Auntie Uju narrated her life's story to Nkechi. Although this was not her first time of telling Nkechi her story, she only wanted to encourage her. She told her how she lost her husband to a terrible fire incident and how life looked empty for her until God showed up and made something good out of her life. Chi, Auntie Uju continued, "I may not know all the solutions to the challenges I face in life, but I hold on to God firmly because I know He has all the solutions to the problems of life. I also may not have everything, but I am content with that which God has blessed me with, and you are one of them," Auntie Uju added. She went further to motivate her with her own life experiences and encourage her to keep living and be hopeful about life. With these words and more words of encouragement from Auntie Uju, Nkechi was strengthened. In her sadness, she found strength, even though her heart felt empty. Every day, she reminded herself that she wasn't under a curse and none of the predicaments of her life was her fault. She began to embrace an internal peace from God. She poured her energy into raising Nnamdi, Obiora, and Chizaram with love and wisdom. She became resilient and promised to carry on for her lost loved ones. Her heart still ached for her losses, but she no longer let the pain consume her. Years passed, and Nkechi's 3 children grew into strong, kind-hearted young adults. Nnamdi and Chizaram followed in their mother's footsteps as fashion designers, while Obiora became a potter. Everyone rejoiced in their success and often spoke of how Nkechi's love and strength had shaped them. One night, Nkechi had a vivid dream. In it, she found herself walking through a beautiful field of flowers. There, she saw her beloved sister, Ugomma, her parents, and her husband, Ifeanyi, all smiling at her. "We are at peace, Nkechi," they said. "Don't let our absence keep you away from having a good life." "None of this was your fault," her mother said. "We are proud of the woman you have become," her husband added. Nkechi wept tears of joy, feeling the love of her family surround her. Though they were no longer with her in the physical world, she knew they were always in her heart. Nkechi woke from her dream with a peaceful heart. She knew that despite all the loss she had faced, she had found happiness again. Her children grew into honorable adults. got married, and bore beautiful children whom Mgbechi loved so much and cherished. She told stories of her sister, her parents, and her husband, keeping their memories alive in the hearts of her children and grandchildren. Auntie Uju, whom Mgbechi's children called Grandma because they grew up knowing her as Mgbechi's mother, passed away after her 95th birthday. This time, Mgbechi wept, but not from a place of guilt. Even though losing Auntie Uju created a vacuum in her heart, she was grateful to God for making her a part of Auntie Uju's life, for letting her experience His wonderful love through Auntie Uju. One day, Mgbechi sat alone and thought back on where she was coming from and where she was now, and as though there was someone else in the room with her, she heard the words, "Though your father and mother forsook you, I will never leave you or forsake you." Surprised by those words and how real they felt, she turned around to see if someone had entered the room without her knowledge. But she could find no one. Then she realized that through her tough times, the times she thought the fire of life would consume her, God was with her, holding and guiding her. Mgbechi lived out her days, surrounded by love and peace, knowing that she had honored her family and raised a generation that would be resilient no matter the challenges they experience on their journey through life. The moral lesson from this story is that resilience, faith, and love can overcome even the darkest and most challenging moments in life. Despite the hardships, losses, and betrayals that Mgbechi faced, she persevered through her faith in God, through the love from Auntie Uju, and through her strong will to live for her family. The story also teaches us that we are not defined by the tragedies in our lives, but by how we respond to them, and that we must never lose hope or forget the strength we carry within us, even when life seems very cruel. Dearest viewer, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, subscribe, and share this video with everyone whom you think will be inspired by it. Don't forget to tell me in the comments section what other lessons you think we can learn from this story. See you in my next video. Bye for now.